Friends, welcome to Coffee with Gaz, where I take a specific topic or question that has been requested by you guys and discuss it in a kind of a nice, brief manner. Today that topic that was suggested was by Daniel Murray in the Triage method community. So if you're not in the free Facebook group, do get involved. The link to that is going to be in the description box below if you'd like to get involved with the group and interact with us. So this week's question or topic is basically going to be the introduction of resistance training to elderly individuals. So first things first, I think the important thing to understand here is the kind of conceptual or theoretical background that would make someone want to ask this question. So first things first, why would you want someone elderly to begin resistance training in the first place? It's a really important question to ask, because this is often one of the kind of first barriers that comes up, is that people don't actually understand the potential benefits that are there. And this is something that we have discussed in our beginner's guidebook. For example, we discussed some of the recommendations of exercise, or the exercise recommendations for elderly individuals. And what you have to realize about aging is that with aging comes a number of changes in the body that basically lead to functional decline and physiological decline. So we see it manifest in terms of elderly individuals, our grandparents, great-grandparents, having decreases in function, declining function, difficulty getting out of chairs, getting out of bed, things like that. So their everyday function decreases, and this is essentially the result of multiple changes that lead to a loss of muscle mass, a loss of strength, a loss of bone mass. So you can get sarcopenic changes, which basically relate to the loss of muscle mass, and you can get osteopenic changes, which basically relates to the loss of bone mass. So you can think of those two as like very simple classifications as to what actually constitutes the loss of function, or what contributes to the loss of function and what results from the loss of function in elderly individuals. Because what you have to realize is that this is basically a bit of a vicious cycle, in that if someone begins to lose their function as a result of the physiological changes associated with aging, what then begins to happen is they reduce their daily activity. So as a result, we have less stimuli to maintain the function that is maintained, or the muscle mass that is maintained, or the bone mass that is maintained. And then the next step from that is a further decline in the amount of activity that person engages in. So you've got this cycle of, one, the initial changes associated with aging, two, those changes leading to a loss of function, or more difficulty associated with everyday tasks, three, a lower engagement or participation in those tasks that they used to, and hence this goes back to feeding into the cycle again. So you can see how we would want to intervene here. So that's a very basic overview as to why this might actually be important. So if you want your grandparents to be able to improve their function, their ability to do their tasks in everyday life, as well as all of the other benefits that are associated with having more muscle mass. For example, one of the things that you might think about in this case is not just the fact that someone can't do something, but if someone is bedbound and more sedentary all of the time, that puts them at greater risk of things like infections, or more prolonged infections, than someone who is going to be more active. So that is one of the things that you tend to see if someone is in hospital and they're bedbound and they're deconditioned and not moving around. One of the things that happens there is, because you're not moving around, you're never forced to take deep breaths, and hence if you do have something like a respiratory infection, it's going to be more difficult to clear that because you're not taking those deep breaths. So that's just one very specific example of where the risks associated with this begin to pop up. And in general, what you do see in the research is that higher levels of muscle strength are associated with longevity, living longer, and living a higher quality of life. So obviously that is something that we would want. So that's our first kind of hurdle, is trying to make it clear to people that this actually is important, because what you're initially going to be met with is some sort of resistance when you're introducing this to someone, because why would I want to lift weights? I'm old, that's not something that people my age do. We go to bingo, or maybe we might do a little bit of light exercise on the bike, but why would I want to engage in resistance training? So the best thing you can do there is become equipped with some of the evidence related to resistance training in the elderly, understand maybe some of the physiology that might be relevant, and then you can begin to at least have some sort of information base to try and justify your intervention to someone. Now that's not always going to be relevant. That's really important to get as well, is that information doesn't necessarily change behavior. So you can't just expect to inform someone and for them to initially or immediately change their behavior, because that's just not quite how things tend to work. So you've got that, your theoretical basis. What are the other barriers that are going to pop up? So the next one is going to be some degree of fear of hurting themselves potentially, or a feeling of low self-efficacy where, the typical response you'll be met with is, I could never do that. Oh Jesus, that looks very hard. Sure, I'd get a heart attack if I did that, okay? That's generally the next step there. And what I always encourage people to do in these contexts, and what I would have practiced in any context in which I've worked with an elderly person, is to start by showing them what they can do, okay? That's really important. So rather than just saying, right, we're going to go through this big workout and don't worry, I know you're going to be able to do it, start at a nice low level and build up that self-efficacy from there. So you might initially think, right, my grandfather, he could definitely do 60 kilo deadlifts. He was working on a farm for years, I know he could do 60 kilo deadlifts. It doesn't mean that you start there. What you could start with is something like a really light kettlebell deadlift with the kettlebell placed on a step, so the range of motion is reduced. It's very easy to see the constraints of the exercise. There's little risk associated with the person falling over or anything like that. And the weight is going to be, pretty light to start off with. So then once you get that person doing that and they experience, hey, I'm actually able to do this, that starts to build up that self-efficacy, and they'll then want to take the next step forward because they might want to see what they're actually capable of. But the only way a person can begin to experience that, or to feel like that, or start thinking like that, is to have the initial experience of success. So this goes for elderly populations and all other populations in which exercise is going to be important, which is everyone. You don't want to just put someone into a workout plan initially that just crushes them and makes them feel like they're not competent enough to engage in that mode of activity. What you want the person to be able to do is accumulate some wins. So you want the person to do a particular task, and then they finish that task and they think, hey, I was able to do that. Maybe later today, or maybe tomorrow or next week, I could actually come back and do that again, but I could progress. So that is all about building self-efficacy, and that is so important when it comes to the elderly. And another thing related to that, not just to do with the self-efficacy, is that kind of fear of injury. So initially people are going to be very concerned about maybe hurting their back or something like that. So what you want to do is ensure you are mitigating the risk of there being any sort of severe discomfort after the first workout. Because even though me and you listening to this, we probably know that having a bit of pain in the back after a workout is normal and that I don't need to worry about it too much, or being really sore after a hard leg workout can be pretty normal. You don't want to necessarily impose that on a new trainee, particularly if they're already resistant to the idea of resistance training. So instead, you make the workout nice and light, nice and accomplishable. You're not getting into extreme ranges of motion or working to failure or anything like that. It's not about testing, just introduction. And then when the person, comes into the next workout and they say, yeah, I might have been a little bit stiff, but, I feel like I could go again. That's very different to the person coming in and saying, Gary, my back was killing me. I couldn't move for the next day or do anything in my daily life. I couldn't get any of my tasks done. There's no way I'm doing those deadlifts again. That's a loss, and we've taken a step down purely because my ego as a trainer was more important, because I wanted the person to work hard and I wanted to push them too far too soon. And that's something we can be very guilty of as trainers at times, because we get this idea in our heads that, it's good for the person to get a really hard workout. Let's crush them, that'll make them come back. But that's just not a good approach, particularly for individuals who are going to be resistant to the idea of engaging in the type of activity that you're promoting to them. Okay, so first things first, understand, this is just a summary, understand your theoretical basis. Like why do you want to introduce resistance training to this person, or in this type of demographic? Why would it be important? Okay. And it generally is really important, but you should know that. You should be able to explain it so that when someone comes and questions you, you're able to feed back and to let them know that what they're doing is actually safe, okay? This time last year, we were working as part of my final placement. We were working in Access Campus with UL, and one of the populations that we were working with was a demographic of people with Parkinson's disease. So these individuals included people, in their 80s, and there were some people who were quite frail. So they've got some sort of condition, Parkinson's disease and probably other comorbidities associated with that, and they're in a population that is elderly and frail, so you can see that there would be a lot of resistance to engaging in resistance training. However, we still introduce things like deadlifts, like squats, like different pressing variations, etc., because we were able to explain to them that, like, you know, this is safe, this is some of the theory, this is why it might be of benefit to you, and then we took those steps from there in terms of getting someone to start off, hey, let's do a light kettlebell deadlift from this step, and then once they nail that, next week they come in, you speak to them about how their experience was last week, and then we might progress to a barbell, really light, you know, staying near the person, giving them cues, reinforcing, positive reinforcement, etc. And then we start to build up that self-efficacy, and all that time we're doing that in an appropriate graded manner whereby the exercise dose is not excessive and is not going to lead to a negative response or adverse responses or potentially a risk of injury that would deter that person from continuing to engage in the exercise program. So that's it in a kind of an applied context. We had a Parkinson's population at that time. Another thing that we were doing at that time was working with MEDEX, which is basically cardiac rehab. And there was an interesting experience that I thought I would share with you guys, whereby one individual, you know, he was actually quite concerned because of his previous cardiac condition that the resistance training, the deadlifts, would be putting too much strain on his heart. Where, you know, that was actually a situation where we had to be aware of the evidence on resistance training in cardiac populations who've had certain surgeries, and then you can come back and say, look, you know, thank you for your concern. Appreciate the concern. I've consulted with, you know, the research and other professionals or whatever, and it seems to be the case that this is actually quite beneficial for someone in your case. So I understand that you're concerned. So why don't we start off nice and light? We'll see how you feel, and if you feel, you know, if you feel in any way poorly, that's no problem. We can change to something else. But if you feel, you know, good and confident, we can begin to progress further. How does that sound to you? Okay, so it shows that you've taken that professional step to say, okay, maybe I am wrong, but I want to make sure that I'm thinking about you, and I'm going to go away and make sure that I have, you know, enough information available. Whoa, we nearly fell over. Enough information available, you show yourself to be professional in that context, and then the person's going to trust you more. So that's really important, particularly as a personal trainer, because if you are a personal trainer, the reality is that your clients probably aren't going to see you as being on the same level as their doctor or their physiotherapist or anyone that they have consulted with previously. So if you do have the opportunity to liaise with the medical professional which they happen to be working with, or who might have given them previous advice, that will be, you know, a really professional step and a really nice step in the right direction in terms of building that relationship, but also showing your client that you actually care about their health in general, and that you're not just trying to get them to follow your program without even thinking about whether or not it's appropriate for them. So they would be some of my major considerations when it comes to the elderly guys. We could of course get more specific into programming details and stuff like that, but they're honestly the things that always come into my head when thinking about that population in particular, but also any population who are going to be resistant to the idea of doing heavy deadlifts, you know. So hopefully that's helpful, guys. As I said at the beginning, you can engage with this process of me recording these videos by simply engaging in the Facebook group. So the Triage Method Community, open access Facebook group, you can pop in any questions, even separate to these videos, just discuss with me and Paddy anything you happen to be interested in, or the other Triage coaches, Lee and Breed, you know, we're all active in there and we're all happy to have any conversations that you'd like to have. So yeah, I hope some of that advice is useful, guys. If you have any more questions, as I said, pop them down below, pop them in the group. If there's something you'd like me to discuss in a future video, I would love to hear it. And that is, I was talking so fast I barely even drank my coffee. That is this episode of Coffee with Gaz. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, of course, be happy and remember that it is, in fact, too easy.